Well, good evening, everybody. Thanks for joining our latest Apiculture Online. We're really going to have a great set of presentations this evening, kind of going outside of our norm and talking about the non-honeybees in celebration of National Pollinator Week, which is going to be occurring next week. So we have a special guest, Dr. Elsa Youngsteadt, from the Department of Applied Ecology here at NC State University, as well as a presentation of our timely topic by Hannah Levenson, who's a PhD candidate in our program. It's been studying the native bees and the non-honeybees of North Carolina. So thanks again for joining us on YouTube, and we'll get right into it. As usual, our first subject or our first segment that we start out with is bees in season, and what you should be doing with your bees right now in kind of the mid-Atlantic area. And it's something that's been a really weird year so far. Oh, sorry. Before I get to that, I just want to make a really quick pitch and announcement. We just opened the registration for our latest online bees school. This one is a one-day only live event, so it'll be live presentations, lectures, and interactions with me and others in our program. And it's really targeted for first-year beekeepers. So the whole idea here is that if you just started your hives for the very first time this year, things have been going really well so far. We want to capitalize on that momentum, refresh what you've learned in your beginner bee schools, and trying to remind you of all the potential pitfalls that lie ahead for the rest of the year so that you can get your bees through the winter. The springtime is always kind of downhill sledding when it comes to beekeeping, because the nectar flow is on and they're building comb and everything's going well. But then in the summer, they get stressed out because of the heat, and then going into winter, it can be, there's many landmines that the bees need to navigate, and you can help them through that. And so the idea of this online bees school is to talk about that. So registration open online. Check out our website. Email us if you have any other questions. And we're really looking forward to it. This is an opportunity to be able to have these kind of live interaction events, but doing it online, not necessarily through Zoom, but using our online teaching platform. So it's really exciting. Check it out. So what your bees are doing right now, at least in North Carolina and adjacent states in the mid-Atlantic, with all this rain and this kind of abnormally cool weather, we're off to such a rockin' start to the year with kind of one of the warmer winters and early springs on record. But summer just kind of is very reluctant to just get here and to get here full-fledged. Nevertheless, the nectar flow is pretty much over pretty much everywhere. We're getting anecdotal reports that, pretty much throughout the region, the nectar flow really wasn't good. It's probably not going to be a very good honey year. So just kind of brace yourself for that. But, again, do what you can. You can't control a lot of those other things. But get ready for that honey harvest. Two Apiculture Online recordings ago, Jennifer gave a really nice presentation about what you need to do to prepare for the honey harvest. So go back and watch that. In doing so, like, follow, and subscribe to our YouTube channel, because that'll really help. But go back and brush up on that. The other thing I alluded to earlier is that next week is National Pollinator Week. And so this is kind of an unusual year. This is the 13th year that they've done this National Pollinator Week. It was passed unanimously by the U.S. Senate. I don't know if that's ever been done since. It certainly doesn't seem that way. But that was unanimously passed in 2007 to have this annual kind of celebration of bees and other pollinators. Is really spearheaded by this organization. It's a nonprofit, the Pollinator Partnership, and they still organize and kind of run it. but it's really a decentralized model where different people in different places put on different activities to promote and to celebrate pollinators. This year, because of the stay-home advice and the other things that we're dealing with, there are not a lot of these kind of large gatherings, but the Pollinator Partnership put together this nice little toolkit. Only some of the examples of things that you can do to celebrate and acknowledge National Pollinator Week, including building native bee houses or other things in your backyard, having pollinator artwork or other displays, planting habitat, right? Go plant that bee tree or a holly bush or some other native plants that can really help local pollinators, having educational events, either online or in small groups. So there's definitely things that still can be done for National Pollinator Week, even though we're not going to be able to kind of have it in a normal outing, right? So definitely something to celebrate. In that same vein, I want to give a quick shout out to some of our colleagues at Appalachian State University, Joseph Krazier, who's on the left, and James Wilk, who's on the right. They're actually both computer scientists and on the faculty there at App State. But they have come up with this new World Bee Count and an app for this World Bee Count. And the whole idea is that you can download this app and you can take pictures of pollinating insects or just pollinators in general. And because they're computer scientists, they're using machine learning and other computer algorithms to try and identify these, where they live, they're time stamped and giving a location, and then trying to learn about how the bees are interacting, where they are, and what they're interacting with in their environment as far as other flowers and plants. And so there's over 12,000 images worldwide so far. As a worldwide phenomenon. And this is another thing that you might be able to do during National Pollinator Week. Go out and get this World Bee Count app and use it on your phone. And when you see foraging bees, take a picture of it, and that'll add to this growing database that will be really useful for researchers for years to come. So, sorry, I kind of skipped ahead here in talking about what the bees were doing right now. But again, to make yourself a really successful and good beekeeper, you always want to be thinking a good 1 to 2 brood cycles ahead. And because a brood cycle, the developmental time of workers is 3 weeks, that means a good month, 3 to 6 weeks from now, what you should be doing now, because this is what your bees are probably going to be doing 1 to 2 brood cycles from now. So even though it's been kind of reluctant to become summer, expect it to hit with a vengeance. So get ready for it to get hot. Get ready for the nectar flow, if any is still going on, to just turn off like a tap, and then the bees will start consuming their stored honey rather than foraging for it. I've already been getting calls about bees in swimming pools. So we already know that when there's not a lot of nectar out there, the bees are tapping into their honey stores, which means they need sources of water, not only to cool down, but to thin out the honey. And so swimming pools are a really big odoriferous, resource in their environment, and can really be a problem for beekeepers, especially in urban and suburban areas. So be prepared for that. If you're keeping bees in an urban environment, make sure that they have a better source of water that's closer than wherever the nearest swimming pool is, so that hopefully they'll lock into that source of water rather than irritating neighbors and causing potential distress. We were talking earlier before we started recording about the need to increase the frequency of your mite monitoring in the next couple weeks, right? Because we had such an early spring and kind of this prolonged spring, the bees have been very broody. They've been raising a lot of bees, raising a lot of brood, and therefore the mites have been busy reproducing as well. And so their mite levels are really starting to get up to the point where you need to be monitoring, if not every single time you go into your hive, at least once a month, if not more frequently. So if you haven't yet this spring, monitor for your mites between now and the next brood cycle to give you an idea of where those mites are at. So with that, I'm just going to turn it over here to, again, our PhD candidate, Hannah Levenson. Hannah is actually an NC State undergrad. She graduated at NC State, but she stayed on with us first as a field technician, starting up this new paradigm within our program on native bees and bee communities across the state. And she just absolutely has taken this and run with it in all sorts of great ways. And she's going to be graduating within the next year and a half. And so she has a lot to share. She won't be able to go over everything that she's done so far, but I'll turn it over to her so that she can give us our timely topic on the 9 non-honeybees in North Carolina.
Awesome. Thanks so much. All right. Everything looked good with that? Okay. Very excited to talk to everyone today. As David said, we're going to talk about non-honeybees and what kinds of bees you can expect to see this time of year. Different bee species have different seasons when they're active. So depending on what time of the year you're outside, you'll see different bees. So if you joined us last time with Deborah Delaney, she kind of talked a little bit about how diverse bees are as a group of insects. And I wanted to quickly build off of that really quick as an introduction. So as you can see from these pictures, bees come in all shapes, sizes, colors. They live differently from each other. They're extremely diverse. We have about 600 different species of bees in North Carolina alone. There are over 4,000 species in North America and over 20,000 in the world. So there's really a lot of them, and it's very exciting to learn about all these different species. And as a quick note, a lot of times when people use the word bee, we're guilty of it too in our labs since we work so closely with them. We're kind of using it as a shortcut to mean honeybee. But in reality, honeybees are just one species out of 20,000 more than in the world. So when you say the word bee, you're really referring to any of these 20,000 species. So you should, if you want to talk to someone else about a different species of bee, you should call it out. So today we'll talk about bumblebees or sweat bees, and I could go on and on and on. And there's a lot of ways that these bees live differently than each other. So one example is bees are very diverse in their size. So this is an example of the smallest bee in the world, Perdita minima. You can see that is next to a dime. So it's very tiny, 2 millimeters. And then on the other side, we have Megachile pluto, which is the largest bee in the world. It's in Asia. So if that freaks you out, don't worry about it. It's not here. But you can see how much larger it is compared to those fingers. It's 3.9 centimeters. And you can basically find a species of bee anywhere in between these two sizes. They're also diverse in their biology. So some bees are specialist pollinators. This example here is a squash bee. So the squash bee, in order to successfully raise their young, they need to visit squash flowers or other plants in the family Cucurbita, so squash, cucumbers, and pumpkins. And without this family of plants, they could not successfully raise their young. On the other side of the spectrum, we have generalist pollinators, so honeybees, bumblebees, lots of other bees that basically could survive off of any flower that's in front of them. Bees are diverse in where they live, their nesting habitats. So the majority of bee species in the world, about 70% of all of those 20,000 live underground. Oops, sorry about that. Here's one example of what a ground nest might look like. So a female bee would burrow down into the ground. Sometimes this could be several feet deep. She will then build individual cells and lay one egg with pollen and nectar resources at the bottom of these cells. Then on the other side, we have those that nest in wood. These habitats are very different from each other. Ground is very malleable. I don't know how these bees live in wood. That would be very claustrophobic, but they can basically burrow right through sound wood, and that's where they build their nests. They're diverse in how they live inside these nests. So the majority of bees in the world, about 90%, are solitary. That means an individual female builds her own nest, collects her own food, lays her own eggs, basically does it all by herself. And then on the other side of the spectrum, we have what we are more used to talking about, social bees, where depending on the species, you could have a couple dozen, a couple hundred, thousand, or tens of thousands living together and working together to successfully upkeep the nest. And then the last thing I'll talk about before I go into specific bees is where these bees can carry pollen. So all bees need nectar and pollen, no matter what species it is. But what's really interesting is they bring these resources back to their nests in different ways. So the majority of bees carry pollen on their hind legs. You can see here how fuzzy this bee's back legs are. It is that color because there's pollen on it, but also because those bright white hairs are where that bee carries its pollen. And this is the way the majority of bee species carry their pollen. Then what we're used to probably seeing more often, pollen balls. So this is really only honeybees and bumblebees. They carry them in their pollen basket. And so this can actually be a really neat trick to help you narrow down what kind of bee you're looking at. So if you see a bee and it looks like a honeybee, but it has pollen all over its hind legs, it cannot be a honeybee. It has to have that pollen ball to be a honeybee or a bumblebee. Next, some bees, leafcutters and mason bees, carry pollen on the underside of their belly. So that's another really quick trick to see what bee you're looking at. And then lastly, there's always an exception to the rule, of course, just to throw us off. Some bees don't carry pollen on hairs or on the outside of their body. This bee is a yellow-faced bee. It actually carries pollen back inside its stomach to its nest. But in addition to that, males in any bee species don't really contribute to collecting resources or raising the young, so they don't have a lot of pollen collecting hairs. There's also some bee species that are parasitic, in which they will sneak into the nest of a different species of bee and lay their egg there, and then the host bee actually collects the resources. So since they aren't collecting resources for their own eggs, they a lot of times look wasp-like, don't have a lot of hair on them. But like I said, they all still need pollen and nectar no matter what. So now that you know a couple things about how different bees can be, a couple places to look on their body for clues about what kinds of bee they might be, I'm going to talk about what bees you can expect to see out right now. So I'll start with one that most people are pretty familiar with, bumblebees. They're generalist pollinators, so they're very common. You see them on a lot of different kinds of flowers. And they do live in social colonies, but they're different than honeybees. They are small-sized colonies, and they are not perennial. Bumblebees only have annual colonies. And then things to look for to tell them apart. Again, they have these pollen balls, so that's a dead giveaway. And then the other thing to look for is hair patterning. So you can see here, this bumblebee has very specific areas that are black and yellow, and different species will have different hair patternings in different stripes of black and yellow. So that's something you can look for. Next, we have sweat bees. They're called sweat bees because they will land on you and drink your sweat for the salt content. So this summer, keep an eye out. If it's going to be an extra hot one, you'll probably have these land on you. They're also generalist pollinators, so you see them basically everywhere. They also live in social annual colonies, but they're very small colonies, maybe a couple dozen individuals. And then things to look for, they carry pollen all over their hind legs. So this back leg on this bee is this bright orange because it's completely covered in pollen. And they also have these bright white hair bands that are pretty distinct. Next, we have small sweat bees, also will land on you for the salt content. Also generalist pollinators, also small social annual colonies. If you can see here, it's kind of hard. That bee has some white pollen all over her hind leg. And I can almost guarantee that everyone here has had this bee land on them in the summer. But because they're so tiny, you can see this is the palm of the hand. So tiny, so dark colored, they're very fast. They're very easily mistaken for flies. So next time something lands on you, take a second, check it out. Maybe it could be one of these bees. The next one I'll talk about is leafcutter bees. They're called leafcutter bees because they will cut almost perfect circles out of flower petals and leaves. And that's what they use to build their nests. They'll almost make little burritos that they lay their eggs in. That's the best way I can describe it. But they're generalist pollinators. These live solitarily. So these are the ones that will live in the bee hotels if you put those out in the bamboo reeds. Things to look for on this bee: they carry pollen on the underside of their belly. You can see this bright yellow pollen on this female. And if you have circles out of leaves or petals in your garden, that might mean you have these bees living nearby. Next, this bee is, it's probably not quite out, maybe in the next couple weeks, but it's a mallow bee. This is one example of a specialist bee, although this bee is said to be a specialist on hibiscus, but as you can see, it'll visit different flowers. But these are cool because they will actually build chimneys at the entrance of their nests. So they're ground nesters and will build up the ground around their nest. So if you see anything like that, it could mean this bee is nesting in your yard. And this is another example of how using those tricks of where bees carry pollen can be helpful. If you see, this bee looks very similar to a bumblebee. It has the same black and yellow patterning. And if it doesn't have pollen, it might be a little hard to tell, but the more you spend time with these bees and check them out in the garden, the more you're going to start to notice subtle differences. So here's an example of a bumblebee compared to this mallow bee. And to me, who has looked at this bee, these legs look spidery. I can tell that their body shape is a little different. So it's an example of how hard these bees can be to tell apart, but the more you spend time with them, the more you'll get used to noticing differences. And then the last one we'll talk about is carpenter bees. I feel like everyone loves to hate them and hates to love them, but they are pollinators. I think they're super cute. But they're generalist pollinators, as I'm sure we know. They nest in dead wood. They are also very commonly confused with bumblebees, which is one of the main reasons why I wanted to talk about them. And things to look for to identify these. As you can see, the back of this bee is extremely shiny and reflective. That's because it has no hair here, where bumblebees will have some amount of black and yellow hair all down the back of their abdomen. So if you see a shiny bee, it could be a carpenter bee. The other thing, this bee's a little hard to see because it doesn't have pollen, but it will carry pollen all over its hind legs. You can see here how fuzzy they are. So they do not have pollen balls like bumblebees. So that's another great way to tell them apart.
That was actually a question, Hannah, on one of the YouTube. Somebody was asking that. So
oh, perfect.
Yep.
And just to show you side by side, so this is the same kind of flower. So you can use size as a reference. Carpenter bees are a lot larger than most of the bumblebee species we have here. There's some bumblebee species that are large. But again, if you see a pollen ball, that automatically tells you something about that bee. All right, so with that, if this piqued your interest and you want to know more about identifying bees, Elsa and I actually wrote this book together. It is through the NC State Extension Office, so it's free to anyone online as a PDF. You can either type in the title into Google or you can follow this link. There's also a bound copy for purchase if you prefer that, but here is what the cover looks like, and I thought I'd give you guys a sneak peek of one of the pages. So in this book, we talk about different genera of bees. We go down to some species, but not every species, but you'll get some facts about them, where they live, a couple key things to look for on their body to tell them apart from other bees, how they nest, what size you can expect them to be, and then what time of year you can expect to find them. So if you want to learn more, definitely check it out. And with that, I think we can move to questions, and I'll invite Elsa to answer any questions we get as well.
Yeah, so I'll just jump in here real quick and introduce a relatively new hire, hired about a year and a half ago, was it, Elsa?
Nearly 2 years. Yep.
Almost 2 years in the Department of Applied Ecology, which is still in the College of Agricultural Life Sciences, but in a different department from entomology. But she's no stranger to entomology, having gotten her PhD in entomology here, and spent a lot of time here and elsewhere doing many different fascinating things. But she was hired on at NC State as the urban ecologist. So she studies many different aspects of urban ecology and how nature interfaces with our big cities. But it just so happens that a passion of hers and one of the main paradigms of her research is on native bees, and particularly on carpenter bees, because they're kind of both pesty and really cool and important pollinators. So it's really great to have Elsa on the faculty here, and I'll open it up for questions for Hannah and her to start a discussion about what Hannah's presentation was all about.
Yeah, thank you. That was great, David. So I think what would be a good place to start is, since David starts every one of these with what the honeybees are doing this time of year, Elsa, what can people expect native bees to be doing this time of year?
So it depends on the species. As you pointed out, we have hundreds to choose from. I did just today, in fact, see the first male Bombus gruciaculus, brown-belted bumblebee of the season for me. So that was, he showed up in that little break in the rain this afternoon. And they do usually appear sort of late May to mid-June, depending on the year. And so that's kind of a big milestone in the colony cycle for bumblebees. That species, once the males and the new queens come out, they will mate, and then the queens will overwinter and everyone else will die, and we won't see them again until like March, April next year. So that's happening for bumblebees. Other species will stick around much longer into the summer, like the common eastern bumblebee. We'll see them up until first frost. Other things that are notable, maybe because we're not seeing them, you mentioned carpenter bees. That was the last bee you mentioned. And they're pretty scarce right now. You probably saw them out in mass in sort of April, May, when they're heavy into their nesting activity. They're making piles of sawdust and bee dung underneath their nests. Now there's not much going on. And the reason for that is that they're sort of in between generations. So those bees that you saw so busy in May have pretty much died. And who remains is the, their offspring, but they're still in an immature state. That probably like large larvae or pupae right now. And they typically start to reappear in early July, late June, early July. Sometime in the next 2 or 3 weeks, we'll start to see them ticking up their activity again. But they won't make any new nests. They won't mate until next, well, some of them might mate in the fall, but mostly in the spring. So these bees live for about a year, and the life cycle, like for the adults, starts sort of in July. So those are some of the milestones out there right now.
Yeah, and I want to make a point that's really interesting, is that as a society, humans have studied honeybees for thousands of years. So there's still so much that we don't know about native bee species, where we know those answers for honeybees. So you were talking about how carpenter bees have multiple generations. There's still a lot of questions about that, and other species only have one generation a year. So there's a lot that we don't know about native bees, which is exciting, but also sometimes frustrating.
There's still a few species out there whose nests haven't even been seen, or where we don't know which male goes with which female. Like each has been seen separately, and we don't know which belong to the same species.
It's like exploring new territory. Okay, another question that I thought would be interesting. So I touched on how different species have different social structures. Probably went through that pretty quick, and that might be interesting to a lot of people that maybe don't know anything other than how highly social bees live. So maybe you could expand on that a little bit.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, so they really, like you mentioned, cover the whole range from completely solitary, where every bee just does her own thing, makes her own nest, collects her own pollen, lays her own eggs, to the very highly social, highly structured society of honeybees. But then there's a lot of gray area in between. Like most of our little sweat bees that you mentioned, the green sweat bees and the small sweat bees, are social but have annual colony cycles where the adult females overwinter alone. They start a new colony alone in the spring, so they sort of act like a solitary bee for a while, and then when their first generation of daughters hatches, they stay home and help. And so you have half dozen, maybe a dozen bees working together, where the workers are still helping their mom like raise her offspring and then produce a new generation that actually does go out and mate. Bumblebees do something similar, but with a larger workforce. But all of our social bees here have this annual colony cycle. Nobody overwinters as a whole colony the way honeybees do. Everybody starts over from scratch in the spring.
Yeah.
And so
And then
right now they're sort of mid-cycle. Like we're starting to see some of the first workers of those, like of the social sweat bees, they're starting to show up now. Bumblebee workers have been out for a while.
Yeah. And then there's a lot of variation for the solitary bees as well. So some people might have aggregations in their yards.
Great point. A lot of times that's most obvious in the early spring, like when Andrina, the mining bees, are coming out. Some of them, like they include our very earliest emerging bees who will start to show up in February, sort of whenever red maple blooms, they're out. And they will often pop up, even though they're solitary. Once they find a good place to nest, they just keep using it. And so those groups will expand, and it'll look like a bunch of little anthills all over the yard. But in fact, it's these solitary bees, each managing her own nest. And
that's called an aggregation, right? Not a colony, right? So the difference, they're not working together, so they're not defensive, right?
Yes,
because we get that all the time of people being afraid that all these bees are flying around, but because they're still solitary, they're more afraid of you than
yeah,
you should be
and
of
they're
them.
probably at their most nerve-wracking when the males are patrolling. Like that's when you see a lot of activity around the aggregation, is the males will just be like swarming around the surface. And that's when it looks the most alarming, but the males actually can't sting at all. And what they're up to is looking for the females, who are all business, just like popping in and out of the nest, like out to get pollen and then popping back in. And so they're not really, neither party is interested in people. So they're really not threatening, and those aggregations will generally disappear in a couple of weeks once the colony, once the life cycle sort of completes for the year and the grass sort of, fills in on top.
Yeah, and I noticed something you made a quick comment of, but I want to actually say it. All female bees can sting you, and no male bees can sting you on any species. So a lot of people have heard carpenter bees can't sting, but maybe you're seeing the male and they cannot sting, but female carpenter bees, just like any other bee, can sting you.
And unlike honeybees, all of the native bees can sting you repeatedly if they want to. Their sting is not barbed, so it stays intact on their body for repeated use, and they don't die after stinging you.
Yeah, but they don't usually.
Right.
You should be fine, not to make people scared. Okay, and then I had another question. So different bee species need a lot of different resources. I touched on generalist versus specialist and how they live in different places. But what do you think people can do to help either specific species or a wide range of species?
Mm-hmm. So there are quite a few things, and you can kind of divide up the bees' needs into like two very basic things, sort of like for any organism. They need food, they need shelter. Food, we probably hear a lot about planting flowers for bees, and that's great. Like we should all do that. We should all have nice flowering, messy gardens. And when we're thinking about what to plant, it's actually helpful to think about generalists and specialists, because those generalist bees can eat not necessarily anything, but they can eat a wide range of pollens and nectars. And so if you have a good diverse garden, they'll find something in it for them. The specialist bees are much pickier. And so, for example, in North Carolina, we have a pretty common specialist that is specialized on mock orange. So that's like a plant that I don't have in my yard yet, but it's like on my list. I'm like, oh, I want to support this bee. We have a morning glory specialist. We have a blueberry specialist. So if you think about some of those specialists and the things they require, it can give you interesting ideas to augment a planting to attract more diverse bees. But then the thing we hear maybe a little less about is the shelter end of the story. And as you mentioned, about 70% of our species nest in the ground. And we still don't know a lot of things we can really do to enhance habitat for them, other than it's unlikely that they will dig through mulch to get to a soil surface, and they seem not to like sort of a thick turf. So if you've got sort of a sparsely vegetated, bare ground kind of area, this is a reason to maybe think of that as a good thing. It is a nesting opportunity and not necessarily something to be, you know, hidden and fixed, because it is a different kind of resource. Bumblebees are also kind of tough customers. Our most common eastern bumblebee is also a picky nester. They use old rodent burrows, usually sort of along the edges of woods. And people have tried a lot of different things to encourage bumblebees to nest in, you know, sort of under flower pots or in nesting boxes. There's nothing wrong with trying that, but if you're going to, sort of be aware that those usually have a pretty low rate of use. And so if nobody shows up, it doesn't mean that you've overlooked an instruction or that you're necessarily doing anything wrong. They're just not very widely used. And a better sort of more sure bet might be to just leave some untouched habitat for them somewhere. If you've got like an edge of a property or whatever, someplace that you can leave a little messy, and everybody says that, and you know, maybe you don't have a messy spot that you can get by with. But if you do, those are definitely areas that some of the bumblebees can find, you know, old burrows, places to nest. The brown-belted bumblebees, the ones that I mentioned that have the males out now, they turn up all the time in old bluebird boxes that haven't been cleaned out. So if you've got a few extra birdhouses, you can leave a couple sort of messy, and the bees will like to use that old nesting material and reoccupy it. And that's probably the most common place I find or hear people finding bumblebee nests. And then one of the last big things that we see sort of promoted as nesting habitat are bee hotels. If you're not familiar with bee hotels, they're those things sort of like little birdhouses for bees. It can be either a block with holes drilled in it, or it can be bundles of reeds or bamboo in some sort of little, you know, shelter. And those are mimicking a habitat that's largely missing in urban areas or has been reduced. The bees that use these bee hotel structures would normally be nesting in like beetle holes in dead wood, or in sort of hollow stems or broken stems or twigs of, you know, trees or perennial plants. So if we're missing those kind of habitats, we can add bee hotels back into the environment to create some nesting cavities for these species. There's still quite a bit of research ongoing. I would say the jury is a little bit out as to how much these really help bee populations. There's no doubt that they're great as far as building human bee relationships and providing a cool opportunity to watch bees forage and be in and out. But we do know that if they're not sort of well maintained and cleaned out, they can accumulate parasites, mites, diseases. And it's interesting because you're taking bees that normally would be very dispersed in the landscape, a nest over here, a nest over there, and sort of sticking them all together, which may or may not be the healthiest thing for them. So I'm not saying don't do it, but if you do put up bee hotels, definitely track down some instructions for good maintenance and cleaning that you would want to do from year to year to make sure that they're not accumulating parasites and pests. And you will also see...
Sorry. I was just going to say, we'll be sure to include some links and stuff to some of those examples, okay. Elsa. So go ahead. Sorry to interrupt.
I was just going to say, you'll also see some nice solitary wasps turn up in your bee hotels. There are lots of non-bee occupants, and that's not a problem. Most of the wasps that live in them hunt either caterpillars or spiders. They kind of do some good pest control themselves, and they're also not aggressive. They're not like your yellow jacket type wasps.
So we have a lot of really excellent questions kind of flying in on the YouTube, but before we get to those, Elsa, you had mentioned something earlier in that last answer to Hannah's question about the habitat. You are developing this really excellent app, right, for developing a pollinator garden, a bee garden that I know a lot of people are really excited about. So can you kind of update us on that and just kind of see where it's at?
Very much still a work in progress. So if there are folks who haven't heard about this work in progress, what it's going to be is a garden design and visualization app where we have illustrations, seasonal illustrations of ultimately a few hundred, currently 60 sort of recommended pollinator plants. And those plants you can represent a plant list that you can filter by like plant height, bloom color, bloom season, soil type, whether you're in the mountains, Piedmont, or coastal plain. And then based on your criteria, you will get this list of remaining plants, which you can then drag and drop into a garden design. And then you can run that design through the seasons to see like which plants will actually bloom together, where do you have gaps. So this is something we've been working on for 3 semesters with the Senior Design Center at NC State in the Computer Science Department. So student teams have been working on the programming. They have a functioning app. You actually, like we have 60 plants illustrated, you can drag and drop, you can run through the seasons. We don't yet actually have it hosted somewhere that it it can be easily accessed. And it's been going through like some bug fixes and some refining to the code this past semester. So that's where we are now. Unfortunately, I don't have the link to say, hey, go try it out, but hopefully in the next few months, we will have some trial version online that you can actually try. And we're in the process of applying for funds to like keep adding to it to get more plant species in there so that it will be fully useful.
Well, that's going to be really exciting because, you know, what's good for all pollinators is usually good for honeybees as well. Although honeybees, for their kind of honey crop, they need big trees and larger landscapes, right? So this is kind of more holistic, right? You're not going to plant a pollinator garden to make a honey crop. You're going to plant a pollinator garden for all pollinators, right?
Yep.
So yeah, no, that's awesome.
Yeah, it definitely feels like a slow,
yeah,
getting it done, but
well, it'll be worthwhile when it comes out because I know a lot of people are going to be really excited about that. It's going to get a lot of traction. So definitely let us know, and we'll invite you back when you have that ready to go.
Absolutely,
So.
there will when it's online, you will know. There will be no. I'll be loud.
Hannah, any other last questions for Elsa before we kind of go to the YouTube questions? Again, there's lots of really good questions for both of you here.
I had one comment, and then I think we can go to those questions.
Okay.
You touched on how most of the time what's good for all pollinators is also good for honeybees. So keeping that in mind, a lot of the same problems honeybees are facing, other bees are also facing. So while honeybees are the only ones that really have to deal with varroa mites, there are other mites that some bees have. Other bees have gut parasites and viruses, just like honeybees. So they're all similar enough that a lot of the things that beekeepers already know can also be applied to other bees. That was my quick comment.
No, good point, and an important point. A lot more work to do, and that's what you've been working on, right? So.
Yeah.
So let's go ahead and open up the Q&A. And again, most of these are directed at you guys, so I'll let you field them as best as you think. First and foremost, are there any native bees that pose a threat to honeybees? And I guess threat, you can define that broadly.
I have gotten this question before. I'll start, but Elsa, you can add if you want. So I'm not sure the way people are asking this question, but the question I've gotten previously is people are concerned about competition between native bees and honeybees. And I think that the big thing to keep in mind is that if there's enough resources for everyone, there's enough resources for everyone. And that when resources are scarce, because honeybees have such large colonies, if you're comparing a 10,000, 60,000 colony to a one bee, solitary bee building her own nest, the competition is non-existent. The honeybees will always be able to collect resources.
It goes the other way, right? The
Yes.
honeybees can actually be a threat to the native bees in that way. I think what they were talking about is more kind of parasitic or predatory. Obviously, all bees are vegans, so they're not predatory, but are there any threats like that?
No. So the thing that distinguishes bees from wasps is, like you said, bees are vegan, so they get their resources from flowers. So pollen is their protein, where wasps get their protein from other insects. So in that sense, the bees, any bee species is very similar to honeybees, where they are all fixed on the same agenda of getting pollen and nectar.
Anything to add there, Elsa?
Nope, I
No,
think
pretty much
you
so.
covered it well.
All right, then I'll ask you the next one. You were talking about kind of bees and wasps, and with all of this just awful and bad and misleading press about the murder hornet, which is finally abating, thank goodness, and rightly so. There was a question about what's the difference between a hornet and a wasp and a bee, right? Because to the general public, anything that flies and might sting you is a bee, right? That's the generic term. Clearly, this presentation and discussion shows differently. What's the difference between a hornet and a wasp and a bee?
So hornets are a subset of wasps, and bees, in fact, could almost, like if you look at the family tree of like bees, wasps, and ants, bees are kind of a branch within the wasps. And the bee branch has gone vegetarian, whereas the others have remained hunters. And then there's actually one sort of weird subfamily of wasps that has also switched to pollen, but they don't live here, so we won't worry about them. So really, it's those diet and lifestyle differences that define them. Where bees are going for flowers, wasps are hunting something. It could be caterpillars, it could be crickets, it could be spiders, it could be whatever. It could be the hot dog on your plate if we're talking about yellow jackets. And so within wasps, hornets and yellow jackets are both groups of social wasps that live kind of, honeybee style in large colonies with many workers that collaborate with a queen to produce, a whole colony in the next generation. So yeah, I'm not sure if I've quite
No, that's good.
The question satisfyingly.
No,
but
that's good. There's a lot coming in, so the faster we can get to them, the more we can get to, which is great. Here's another one to you first, Elsa, and then another one back to Hannah. You were mentioning the bee hotels. There's a question here from Larry who was asking about what's the best time to replace those bamboo straws in a bee hotel? What season is best to do that?
Right, and that's it's a tricky thing because there's always somebody in there. If you let's say you're dealing with a bee whose life cycle, like the bee is flying in the spring and you see them going in and out of the nest, but once you stop seeing them, their offspring are still in there developing and won't emerge until the following spring. And the moment they emerge, they could come back and start reoccupying the same hotel. So there's no time that you can just take the whole thing down and pitch it without destroying residents. So what you need to do is make some sort of emergence box. It's just a dark box with a bee-sized hole in it that you would take your used hotel down in the fall and stick it in this box and leave it somewhere cold over the winter. And the bees who emerge from that used hotel in the box will see the light leave through the bee-sized hole, but that box will no longer be attractive for bees to come back into. It's not their search image. So meanwhile, you will have put up a fresh one that those emerging bees will go occupy and make their nest. And then at the end of the season, once everybody's out of the one inside the box, you can then compost it, throw it away, bleach it, whatever you're going to do to it.
Okay, great. So Hannah, I think this one's a good one for you. One of the attendees here had heard that mason bees are better pollinators than honeybees. Is that rumor or fact?
So it depends on what the crop is, but sometimes yes. So honeybees have a particular behavior. They're very good at pollinating large patches of the same kind of flower. And they're pretty good at just like zeroing in on that resource. And then if they need assistance from humans who are beekeeping them, we can give them food. Where native bees might have a particular crop if they're specialists, in which case they might be better suited to that flower than a honeybee. They also they're not as good at surviving off of large monoculture patches like our agriculture system is set up for. One example where a bee might be better suited is bumblebees are actually one of the best pollinators of tomatoes. Tomato flowers require buzz pollination, and bumblebees and some other bees are able to buzz at the exact frequency to release the pollen from the flower, and honeybees cannot buzz at that pollination or that frequency. So there are cases where the behaviors of certain bee species are better for that flower or that crop.
So Elsa, I think Hannah was even being a little too fair to honeybees there. You know, I always teach that kind of on a bee for bee basis, honeybees are among the least effective pollinators. They just
There are
make up
so
for it
many
in their
of them.
numbers. Correct. So
Yeah.
would you agree with that?
Yeah, exactly. Like I think the question was about mason bees specifically, and I never remember the exact statistic, but it's something like 20 mason bees can do what a whole colony of honeybees does in terms of pollination in an apple or almond orchard. But you would never put mason bees in like your cucumber field because they're out of season and don't visit that kind of flower. So
Yeah.
just to back up what Hannah said, it's on a crop for crop basis, and a lot of native bees can be more efficient, but they don't have the numbers. And if you have a giant field of something you need pollinated, you can put honeybees down in the middle of it, and you can't do that with just any old wild bee. So
Yeah. There's another question here about bees that lay eggs in other bees' nests. So what are those, and what are some maybe an example from each of you? And are any of those nests honeybee nests?
Yeah, I can start, I guess, since I'm the one that opened that box. They're called kleptoparasitic bees. Usually they have a certain set, whether it's a couple or even a single native bee species that they're kind of paired with. So one example is a zebra bee or cuckoo bee. It will only lay its eggs in the nests of sunflower bees or longhorn bees. But there's always a parasitic bee for different groups of native bees. So there's a parasitic bee for sweat bees and other bees. I don't want to take all the examples if Elsa wanted to go.
no, it's fine. And I'm trying to think how to do this because we could sit here and say names of parasitic bees, but if you can't see them, it might not be that exciting. But some of the most evident ones, like usually parasitic bees are not very common. It's just sort of their ecology. They have to be much more rare than their hosts. So you don't see them a lot. But some of the ones that you can see, if you're lucky enough to have one of those sparse yards with an aggregation of mining bees in the spring, if you sit there and watch closely for a while, you will see these little orange or yellow bees. They look very much like a little wasp. You'll see them kind of patrolling the same area, and sometimes you'll see them sneak down one of the nests, one of those little mini anthill looking nests. Those are nomad bees, and they're like pretty common parasites of the mining bees in the spring. And then another one to look out for if you have a bee hotel with leaf-cutting bees, Coelioxys is their cuckoo leaf-cutting bee. Has a very pointy butt. It looks kind of like a leaf-cutting bee, only very sharp on the end, and it uses that pointy end to like tear up the nest that it then so it can get in and parasitize it. So those are a couple you can keep an eye out for. But generally, the fact that they're around means that you've got a healthy population of the host that can support them. It's not really a worry, except in the case of a bee hotel where maybe they do accumulate over generations and you need to do some maintenance to keep the balance as it would be. But
Right.
And to answer the second part, I forgot, none of our native bees here parasitized honeybees, but in other areas of the world, there are species of honeybees that can parasitize honeybee nests. So where they are native, there are native bees that can parasitize them.
So we don't have to worry about that here.
Yep.
Okay. Yeah. I knew that. I just wanted to make it clear so that
fair point.
We don't get starting emails from murder bees, murder hornets. So there's another interesting question here. I kind of open this up to anybody who might comment. We're starting to kind of stray away from kind of native bees necessarily, but there's a comment made about how ants and ant colonies really like to inhabit honey bee hives, especially in between the inner cover and the lid, right, where it's kind of on top and out of the way and everything. And so there's a question about if there is kind of an association in general, if other ant species do tend to associate with other bee nests not just honeybees? Is there some sort of mutual benefit? Like, I know that some plants like to have ants on them to keep herbivores away, right? I don't think there's that kind of mutualism going on with ants and honeybees, but is there something like that going on with any of the native bees that we know of?
I don't know of anything. I have occasionally found ant nests in unoccupied bee hotels. Like ants are another character who will use those nesting cavities as a resource, but I cannot think of any relationships really between ants and bees in their nests or otherwise.
Yeah, I can't either, but that doesn't mean they don't exist, just that we haven't found it yet.
And they would generally not encounter each other on flowers. Like flowers are generally designed to keep ants off because ants are terrible pollinators and bees are much better. So they don't tend to see much of each other on flowers either.
Yeah. Okay, any other last questions? I might have missed some, and apologies, because I know they're coming in. Oh, here's a good one. Which are better pollinators for blueberries? And I guess I'll qualify that and say either the rabbit eye or the high bush rather than the low bush blueberries, because that's what we tend to have down here. Bumblebees, carpenter bees, or honeybees? Who would you want in a race on that?
Bumblebees and blueberry bees.
Yeah, one that's not on the list, blueberry.
Yeah.
Yeah,
they're super efficient. The Habropoda, the southeastern blueberry bee, it looks like a miniature bumblebee or a miniature carpenter bee. They're a solitary species that's super efficient at pollinating blueberries, and then bumblebees are fantastic. Carpenter bees tend to nectar rob. They'll bite through the flower and steal the nectar and transfer very little pollen, so they're not the best visitors.
Now, you mentioned the specialist, the southeastern blueberry bee, which again, yeah, it's very, very efficient. But are there population densities large enough to have, kind of large fields like we grow them?
I'm trying to remember. I mean, certainly on some of the smaller farms, like I don't know exactly at what scale they start to drop off, but they're definitely like enough of them to be economically important. And on some of the smaller farms, like I remember some study, I think it was like from the 80s, that concluded that one female bee pollinates like $20 worth of blueberries in small commercial operations. But yeah, you're right. At some scale, there's not enough like good habitat around the edges for them, and they don't make it to the middle, and you need to like put some bumblebees there or some honeybees.
Yeah, so it's probably the acreage, not just the acreage of the blueberries themselves, but the surrounding habitat, right, of where they might be nesting. Because the southeastern blueberry bee is a ground nester, right?
Yep.
Yeah. So yeah, lots of other things to think about. Well, let's see if we can take one more question here. There's lots of, again, we're not going to be able to get to all of these. I'll leave this last one here for Hannah, since I know she's kind of studying these. Can honeybees get infected with bacteria or viruses from native bees? And that's posed by a beekeeper, right?
Yeah.
So do our bees get infected by the other bees? And then since you study those other bees, it's kind of the other way. It's a two-way street, right?
Yeah. So that's actually one of the main parts of my project, is measuring viruses that different bees are experiencing across the state. And there is more evidence for honeybees sharing pathogens with native bees than the other way around. And one reason for this is, again, just their numbers. Honeybees can build up pathogens really quickly. That's why it's really good for you to keep your mite counts down, because once there's an infection, it spreads really quickly through the colony, where if there's a solitary bee and she has an infection, she's not really going to spread it to other solitary bees. So it's more of a concern of numbers. It's a number game. There are some times where different flower shapes can aid in the spread of pathogens. So if it's a gut pathogen and a bee defecates on a flower, they could then spread that to the next bee that comes to the flower. But again, it's all about how infected that bee is. And so more times than not, it'll be honeybees spreading it to native bees. I don't know if there's any evidence specifically of native bees spreading it to honeybees.
Elsa, any last comments on that last issue?
Nope. Yeah, nope.
It's a very messy situation to say the least, right?
Yeah,
So
I
I
think
think,
Hannah is the ideal person to answer
yeah,
that question.
exactly.
And I think, I mean, the only other thing would add is that some of the, like just to emphasize the one way from honeybee to native bee transmission is some of these parasites have a life cycle that requires like having adult bees year round for it to transmit. And since native bees have these life cycles where there are gaps in the adults, the solitary bees just like they're a dead end for some of these parasites. So although they can catch it, they don't really maintain a population of that, parasite or disease organism.
Well, as usual, all great questions from our attendees on the YouTube channel. Thanks, Dr. Youngsteadt, for being our special guest this evening. Thank you, Hannah, for a fantastic presentation on behalf of the apiculture program. I do want to quickly say that we are doing these apiculture onlines every other week. So our next one is going to be on July 1st. The timely topic is going to be on pesticides and honeybees. And a recent graduate from our program, literally a few weeks ago, Dr. Joe Malone, has moved from NC State to start his new position at the EPA, but he's going to come back and join us and lead the timely topic. And then he's going to interview Dr. Frank Rinkovic, who is at the USDA down in Baton Rouge, and he's an insect toxicologist, and we have collaborated with him, and he's done a lot of really excellent work on toxicology and evolution of resistance of mites to miticides and other things like that. So be sure to catch that 2 weeks from tonight. Again, like us and comment and subscribe to our YouTube channel. That'll help us out greatly. Thanks for your attendance, and we hope to see you 2 weeks from tonight. Thanks.